Well, welcome to ESGX Live, the community for information and education to inspire collaboration and action to help build or rebuild a stronger and more resilient economy and society. With me, Nigel Lake in New York, and my co-host in San Francisco, Paul Herman. We have a fantastic discussion coming up today with Stephanie Kelton, author of the book, The Deficit Myth, which I have here. I have not yet finished, but I have to say it's a fantastic read and well worth your time. Just as a very brief introduction to what's coming up, I guess I was reminded in reading this about the famous quote from Dickens about having slightly more income than your expenditure being happiness and slightly less income than your outgoings being an absolute disaster. And of course, that was ingrained in me as a kid. And it's something I've lived with most of my life. I grew up in the UK. We went through the terrible years of the 1970s. I remember eating breakfast or lunch or dinner by candlelight, cooked over a gas stove. There was all sorts of changes eventually brought about by Margaret Thatcher, some of which was good, some of which was terrible for the people that were left behind. And of course, since then, a lot of water has run under the bridge. This is interest rate or GDP in Japan, a very long period of low growth, and various other countries have followed down the same path since then. Of course, all of the things that we're talking about today matter because of these various different crises that we're dealing with. The COVID outbreak, where the case numbers globally are now just short of 24 million. That was this morning, over 800,000 deaths, a lot of tragedy as a result of that. We have a financial crisis that is running. We have all of the knock-on effects which flow on from that to deal with. And of course, you may worry about the debts that are being run up around the world. We have environmental crisis. I've spent part of my time in Australia. We've had terrible fires and floods there. Of course, now shocking fires on the west coast of the US and more beyond. So really with that as a quick reminder as to how very significant these issues are, I will hand over to Paul Herman very shortly to introduce the show. A quick reminder to introduce yourselves in the chat, do join the discussion there. There is a Q&A function. If you put your questions in the Q&A, we will have a better chance of finding them and we will do our level best to answer them. And finally, thank you for joining us if you're on YouTube, and do please share there as well. Every time you hit the like button, about 15 more people watch our guests' messages, so we very much appreciate that. So I will leave it over to Paul to take away the show.
Great, thank you, Nigel. I'm Paul Herman from HIP Investor. Delighted to have another monthly episode of the Green Jobs Report. With us today is Dr. Stephanie Kelton. I can't wait to get my book copy signed post-COVID. So thanks, Stephanie, for bringing it together. And there's also an online book club on Vimeo that goes through each chapter as well that you can rewatch, which a couple hundred people had joined. And then, of course, Dr. Fadhel Kaboub of Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity and Denison University, and Amir Khalegi at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And Dr. Scott Fullwiler will not be joining us today. So we'll have a focus panel among Dr. Stephanie, Dr. Fadhel, Amir, and myself. Just a quick intro before we do the monthly jobs report. At HIP Investor, we have 5 pillars. We originally based those on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Those are health and wealth, earth and equality, and trust. And you'll hear at the conventions, people talking about the health crisis, COVID crisis. You'll hear them talking about the wealth and income inequality. We all know that we're in a climate crisis, the earth pillar. But we're also in an equality crisis, including racial justice and equality across generations, as well as gender inequality. And we're really in a crisis of trust, of corruption, of taking advantage of systems that don't benefit everybody. So this health, wealth, earth equality, trust crisis needs systemic responses. So what we'll first go through today is what's happening in the US with the real jobs information changing month by month. And then Dr. Stephanie Kelton will come in, provide some feedback on what she sees in jobs, economic, and policymaking. And all of us will have a deeper discussion around what specific green jobs policies, green jobs programs, and actions that we can all participate and engage with. All right, Amir, if you can come online, I'll start up the slides for this month, and welcome Amir to this month's Green Jobs Report.
Thank you, Paul. So for our August 2020 Green Jobs Report, for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, our Green Jobs Report measures the direction, momentum, and changes towards greener jobs to promote a more sustainable economy. The way that we analyze our green jobs is by looking at companies that are scored by human impact and profit ratings, which Paul mentioned has pillars of health, wealth, earth, equality, and trust pillars that promote people, planet, and trust. The way that we link these companies to the industries is by taking NAICS codes, and we connect it with the current employment statistics surveys. The greenness of industries will vary depending on their human impact and profit rating, but some examples of highly rated industries, medium rated industries, and low rated industries would be that of recycling services and cleaning compound manufacturers as highly rated industries, hospital and insurance agencies as medium rated industries, and the lowest extractive industries would be that of oil and gas extraction and casinos. So what we have consistently found is that greener industries have been the most resilient and most stable during the COVID-19 crisis. Proportionally, greener rated industries have been the least impacted during COVID-19, with a reduction of employment of about 5%, as compared to the most extractive industries that contain around 13% or 12.74%, and they have sustained the highest proportional job loss. So on a month-to-month view, this story is the same, right? So greener industries have been the most resilient, and we should pay special attention to the March and April months, because that's when the economy started closing and we saw the greatest effects towards the COVID-19 crisis. And we can see that significantly, the greener industries were least affected with a reduction of 6.7%, while the most extractive industries sustained a 18% loss proportionally to their employment since February. So not only do we measure human impact and profit ratings, a portion of that, a pillar of that, is the products and services that industries provide. And the greener industries provide products and services that are net beneficial to society, while extractive industries produce products that are less beneficial, perhaps towards the environment, or extractive of their employment and such. But something that to be noted from the month-to-month change is that the net positive industries were the first to recover. So although substantially across the board in March to April, there was almost a similar reduction, the greener, more positive products and services, those industries were the first to recover, as seen from April to May and May to June. So looking at the initial unemployment claims, we saw an extreme hike in initial employment claims as the economy had shut down due to COVID-19. This peaked on April 18th with a total of 5.8 million initial claims. But since the peak, unemployment claims have experienced a consecutive decline due to the reopening of the economy. And we should take, specific note of the leisure and hospitality sector, because they were the most affected. We will, look more closely at this sector in the following slides, but as an overview, we saw a return of employment of 592,000 in June, and previously a return of 2.9 million in May. So again, looking closer at the leisure and hospitality sector, the return of employment in this sector is correlated with the decline in UE claims, initial UE claims. So from February to April, leisure and hospitality lost around 8 million jobs due to the lockdown. And this equates to a 51% decline in the employment of this sector. The reflection of the return to employment is seen in the decline of the UE claims, which was shown on the previous slide. But as of right now, leisure and hospitality employment is still 4 million jobs below the February estimate. Turning to average hourly earnings, in May and June, we saw record declines in average hourly pay with the decrease of 1.8%. And this is correlated with the cutting of lower quality jobs, especially those in leisure and hospitality, your restaurants, your accommodation services. So these lower quality jobs so actually, let me rephrase that. So April, we saw a 4.7% increase in average hourly pay, which is a record amount. But this is correlated with the cutting of lower quality jobs that was seen in, sectors like leisure and hospitality. And due to the, I guess, eradication of these jobs, we saw a readjustment of the average hourly pay. So although we saw a 4.7% increase, this is due to the mechanics of averages. And by cutting these lower quality jobs that are associated with lower pay, it recalculated the average to appear as we were getting higher average hourly pay across the economy. But this was not the case. But thankfully, in July, we actually saw the inklings of the return to those leisure and hospitality sectors. So we're starting to see the normalization of hikes in average hourly pay as opposed to what we saw in April. So what we see here is a month-to-month view of the average hourly pay. And something to notice here is that March to April for the net extractive industries saw the highest hike in pay, but this is correlated with these industries being more tendent to cut lower quality jobs, and the proportion of lower quality jobs were higher in these net extractive industries. If we were to look at the net positive industries seen in green, we see that it remained the most stable as compared to the net extractive industries, with only an increase of 3.45%, which was below the national average seen in April, whereas the net extractive industries were seen to have these higher pay cuts due to the cutting of lower quality jobs. This again is seen here, right, in taking note of the changes in employment. The chart here is showing the month-to-month change percentage-wise in employment since February. And we see for the net extractive industries, a substantially larger amount of reduction as compared to the net positive industries. The most extractive industries saw a reduction of 18%. Medium tiered industries saw a reduction of 15%, and the net positive industries only saw a reduction of 6.7% and remained the most stable throughout the entire COVID crisis, which just is another bullet point towards that net positive industries have higher quality jobs and are, while net negative industries have more low quality jobs, and they were more tendent to cut these low quality jobs as the economy was affected by the COVID-19 crisis. So despite reductions in the average hourly wage, green jobs still remain the highest paying and highest quality jobs. As seen here, these are the absolute amounts of average hourly pay for each of the human impact plus profit rating intervals. And you can see substantially that net positive industries have a higher paying, higher wage as compared to net extractive industries. So although there was a decline in average hourly pay seen across the entire economy, the net positive industries still remained the highest paying when compared to other jobs throughout the economy. So moving towards, high contact sectors of the economy, we mimicked the analysis by the St. Louis Fed in terms of looking at occupations that weren't that the social distancing propensity of occupations throughout the economy. So for definition, high contact industry sectors would be occupations which require work to be within 1 arm's length, where low contact industries contain occupations that allow for social distancing. We can see that obviously high contact industries had a higher absolute amount in terms of reduction of 8.8 million since February, whereas low contact industries had a reduction of 3.8 million uh, in employment since February. But as this next slide shows, even in high contact sectors, greener industries are more resilient to the job loss. So what we did is looked at the industries that were in high contact and low contact, and we divvied them up by their HIP rating. And we found that industries with a higher HIP rating were less likely to lose jobs, even within the high contact industry sectors. And within high contact industry sectors, you can see here, right, the industries that were below a 30 HIP score saw a reduction of around approximately 17%, whereas the industries that were above 30 HIP score had a reduction of 14.7%. And the case was still remained the same in terms of low contact industries for the resiliency of higher HIP scored industries. So we see here that below 30 HIP score, we see around a 9.4% decrease in employment since February for low contact industries, whereas industries that were above a 30 HIP score had around a 5.3% reduction. In terms of absolute amounts, in high contact industries, from May to June, we saw a 1.4 million return in jobs for industries that were above a 30 HIP score rating, whereas industries that were below a 30 HIP score rating, we saw a return of 900,000. So we saw a higher return. Even we saw a higher return in absolute terms for industries that were above 30 HIP rating as well. And the key takeaway here is that greener jobs remained more resilient when compared to extractive industries, not only in high contact to low contact, but across the board in terms of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. So future analysis for our green jobs report is we have taken a deep dive in looking at the current employment statistics survey, which releases the monthly jobs report and releases a month by month update of those numbers. What we want to begin looking at is the OES survey, or the Occupational Employment Statistics Survey, which is an annual survey that is conducted by the BLS, the same people who publish the CES estimates. But what we want to do is start looking at the occupations within each industry and providing comparisons. So for example, this diagram here, what we will do is start by looking at an industry supersector, so such as health services. We then look at the 4-digit NAICS industry code, which would equate to industries such as offices of physicians, outpatient care centers, home health care services, which all have a unique HIP score that we have placed on these industries. We then, due to the OES survey, have occupational data. An example of these occupations would be that of management, community and social services, healthcare practitioners. And normally there's around 15 to 20 major occupational examples that are given within the OES survey. But as compared to the CES survey, since this survey is on an annual basis, we have a more granular, more detailed pool of data that we can compare. So for example, we can compare hourly wages, the annual wages, the median wages, and even the wages for the top 25 percentile, the lowest 25 percentile. And we can also analyze it by location. So on a national scale, state scale, or even as small as a metropolitan scale or magnifying granularity. We also have the option of looking at the occupational percentage, which is the percent of the industry employment in a given occupation. So for example, whether healthcare practitioners within offices of physicians make up 30% of the employment within that specific industry. But something that we also want to promote as a final note to help us in our additive process of looking at HIP scores, it's continually evolving. And what we want to do is promote company transparency, especially in terms of environmental terms, because a lot of companies aren't incentivized to show their earthly practices, environmental practices. So what we want to do is promote a standardized system of reporting, which would provide benefits that avoid fraudulent behavior, exploitation, and overall garner socially beneficial practices and overall accountability for companies within the United States. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Amir. Another insightful, compelling Green Jobs report. So these slides will be posted on the ESGX site. So if you want to go back to them or look at them or share them with your colleagues or analyze them, please let us know. So Stephanie, if you want to come on the screen, want to bring you on board. In the chat box, we circulated the not only the link to the deficit myth, but also the Vimeo book club. And then somebody also asked about the job guarantee. So there's another book by Dr. Pavlina Chernova about job guarantee. And when you go to Amazon and you say, who else buys books that are related, you'll see these two pop up together. So Stephanie, tell us what you're seeing today in terms of green jobs and how that might be blending into policy and policy proposals. And there's also this overhang of like pay as you go. And do we need to do that or not? Or are there other ways of financing transition to a greener economy?
Sure. Well, let me just start by saying thank you to you and to the others for the invitation to join you for a little bit of time today. This is really nice. So I think, the work that you're doing is so interesting and so important. And so I feel very lucky now to have gotten a preview of this because we did a dry run, people don't know, a few days ago. So I got to hear this wonderful presentation twice. Look, I was on CNBC this morning and I thought we were going to spend a little bit more time talking about the economy and, in the context of the convention, and we have these sort of competing narratives, right? As we did before, really, actually, about whether we've got a good economy, whether we had a good economy, whether what we really want to do is build the economy that we had, just bring it all back. Right, and restore something that we can call normal. And so much of what I'm hearing just, harkens back to 2016. We all remember, the candidates then, Secretary Clinton and Donald Trump. And you had, on the one hand, Donald Trump speaking to some very real and persistent problems in the economy. Now, he's no environmentalist, to be sure, but he understood certain things, certain realities, let's say, about the way the economy was working and for whom it was working and who had been left behind. And he addressed that pain. And he spoke directly to people in hard-hit communities, in hard-hit regions of the country. And I'll never forget him saying, help is on the way. Help is on the way. That message really, I think, resonated. And on the other hand, and this is not to knock Secretary Clinton, really, but the other message was, he's saying make America great again, and she's saying America's already great. And there was a disconnect there. You know, we have this idea that if there are jobs, then that's enough, that there are jobs, but it's not enough. And your work is so important here because you're talking about good jobs, resilient jobs. What kind of jobs do we want? Because we've lost so many. We've got 28 million Americans on income support now who've been, you know, dislocated from their employment as a result of coronavirus and the lockdowns and the economic fallout. And we've only brought back about 4 in 10 lost jobs so far. So we have a long way to go. And the question is, you know, where do we go? What are the policies that are going to help shape the future recovery? And it's not enough just to bring back jobs. We brought back jobs last time. It took 76 months. It took a little over 6 years to claw back the jobs that were lost in the wake of the financial crisis and the Great Recession. But we know that the jobs that came back were in almost all respects inferior to the jobs that were lost. So they were lower hour, lower wage jobs. They weren't quality jobs. And your work is shining an even brighter light on the nature of employment, what kinds of jobs are most resilient. And so I think there is an opportunity here. And, you know, you're raising questions about politicians and legislation and pay-fors and the fights, the battles that lie ahead. There are clearly opportunities here. We can take advantage of an economic environment where we've got tens of millions of people who want to work, and we can put them to work doing the kinds of jobs in green tech and, you know, green jobs more broadly, that will help us build back, as Vice President Biden says, better, stronger, more resilient, more responsibly. So, you know, that's the backdrop against which my book is now sort of floating around out there. And, you know, we all went through 2019. We saw a very crowded field of Democratic presidential hopefuls who, you know, had platforms ranging in ambition from a very ambitious Green New Deal to a slightly scaled down version to, you know, a next to nothing version and everything in between, you know, healthcare and student debt and the whole of the thing. And everyone listening now knows, I'm sure, that 2019, these candidates were dogged at every turn with this question: how will you pay for it? Where is the money coming from for all of these things you want to do? And each of the candidates, and I mean across the board, everyone had an answer to that question. They could draw a line from every item on their policy agenda to the revenue source that was going to pay for it all. Okay, so that was 2019. The money had to come from somewhere. It all had to be paid for. Now, fast forward to 2020, and all of a sudden, everything has changed, because we have coronavirus, and all of a sudden the whole debate, all of the pay for questions, all of the concerns about deficits and so forth go right out the window. We have a crisis and we have to act, and we have to act quickly. And Congress starts spinning out legislation, sometimes multi-trillion-dollar spending bills, without a moment's pause for where is the money coming from, how will we pay for it? You know, they just order up the cash. That's what's happening. Congress writes what we call in Washington, I worked on the Hill for a little while, a clean bill. A clean bill just provides one set of instructions to the Federal Reserve, which is the government's bank. The clean bill says to the Fed, get ready. We are ordering up $2.2 trillion for the CARES Act, and you're going to make the payments on behalf of the US Treasury. That's a clean bill. A dirty bill, a clunky bill, a pay-for bill, sends two sets of instructions. It tells the Federal Reserve, we're going to be spending $2 trillion on XYZ, and we're going to be asking you to debit, to mark down the size of balance sheets of bank accounts, because we're raising taxes on these people in these ways. So two sets of instructions. Some people will receive credits to their bank accounts because the government is spending. Some people will see their bank accounts debited because the government is raising taxes. So the question going forward is, I think, one important question: when do we have to start picking two fights? When do we have to start offsetting some of the spending that we want to do for relief and recovery and reform going forward? How much low-hanging fruit is there? How much room is there in the economy to safely handle additional spending before those offsets become necessary, before we have to start thinking about, I want to put $1 in, but I'm going to need to take $1 out because I need to reduce purchasing power as I add it so that I don't provide too much, lead to too much spending and inflation. That's it. So a large part of what the book is about is trying to get us to think about the federal budgeting process differently, approach the question differently. Don't go into it with the mind frame or the mindset that everything has to be fully offset, that we need to pass legislation that adheres to PAYGO always. We don't. And I suspect we won't for quite a good while because the economy is going to remain very depressed. Unemployment levels are going to remain high. And as long as, you know, inflation is remains low and we don't see potential for inflation flaring up, we can accomplish a lot. And we need to, right? There are all of these pressing, urgent problems. I have a chapter in the book called The Deficits That Matter, that try to get us focused on the real deficits, real problems, real challenges in our economy, turn our attention away from obsessing over this budget outcome, because that's what got us into trouble last time, right? Congress did the stimulus bill and then basically went AWOL. And that was it. And then left it all up to the central bank, left it up to the Fed. And so I'm going to close with this one observation. We know that we don't want to leave it up to the central bank. And guess who else knows? Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Fed, Ben Bernanke, former Fed chairman, Janet Yellen, former Fed chairman, all of them, right? Powell gave remarks today. He is making it very clear, we got to have a fiscal partner. You don't want us trying to do this alone. Janet Yellen in an op-ed just today, same thing. Don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Fiscal policy, government, Congress, you have to be in the game. Ben Bernanke in an op-ed just in the last few months, very powerful message for Congress. Don't do to this Fed chairman what you did to me. Don't hang him out to dry. Don't close up the purse strings before the job is done. Get in there and stay in there. And so we've got the resources when it comes to funding major legislation. We can handle that. That's actually the easy part. The difficult part is deciding, prioritizing, and figuring out where, you know, what strategically, what to invest in, where to get the most bang for the buck, you know, where to make the right long-term investments for, you know, prosperity for the sake of the planet and so forth. So that's it. That's how I'm thinking.
Okay, so that's really exciting. And just want to brief everybody, we've scheduled an hour. We're probably going to go longer than an hour. It'll depend on your questions and our answers. So feel free, as you're already doing in the chat box and the question box, to tee those up. Fadhel will welcome you on screen as well. So I have a question. It's going to sound a little bit quirky on the way in. You know, Hollywood movies are combinations of previous Hollywood movies. So like Star Wars was a spaghetti cowboy Western set in outer space, for example, or, you know, Predator was Alien with Arnold Schwarzenegger, you know, in a jungle. Policy sometimes is easier to remember when it's like Franklin Delano Roosevelt had the New Deal, and that was a lot of fiscal policy and jobs policy, and less of the Federal Reserve turning on its power to now essentially buy exchange traded funds and muni bonds from states and cities, as well as muni bond ETFs. And so we had some deficit spending during Ronald Reagan in 1980. We had FDR in the 1930s and 1940s. We had more deficit spending under Bush 1 and Bush 2. We have a tremendous amount of Bush deficit spending under Trump. We had some deficit spending for recovery, the American Recovery Act. And you can even go into the future. Maybe there's like a, you know, future candidate. But what would, if Stephanie Kelton was the 2020 candidate, what would be the message, and what mixes of previous policies and new policies would you blend together in the solution to get us towards a more stable society?
Well, that's interesting. I think that in many ways, when this was all unfolding in sort of mid-March, I think one of the very first things that I said publicly was nationalize payroll. It was absolutely, in my view, critical to try to keep workers attached to their employers. And so you keep them on payroll and out of the workplace. That was the right thing to try to do. And that's sort of what we tried to do with the payroll protection program, right? And the small business lending. It's just that, we didn't execute flawlessly, and for a variety of reasons, one of them being that we were starting from scratch with a program like this. We're looking off to Europe and saying, oh, they do it this way over there, we should try that. And the problem is they've been doing it that way in Germany for 100 years. So they have a century of,
including during 2008.
Yeah, and it's there's a cultural thing, the nature of the work is different. And so for a variety of reasons, it works better. And we tried to cobble it together very hastily and then rely on private banks. And well, everybody here knows we ended up with, more than 40 million Americans filing for jobless claims. So we didn't execute, but I think the spirit, the intention was correct. So now the question you're posing me is in 2020. So where are we now? Well, we are in a situation where, as I said earlier, only 4 in 10 jobs have come back. We know that many of the businesses that closed, and they said temporarily, more than half now, the expectation is that they are going to be permanently closed. Those jobs that were associated with those are going to disappear, not temporarily, but many of them are permanent job losses. So one of the things that I think is really vital going forward, and this is like a New Deal era program, so learning from the lessons of the past, is we can create jobs directly. We don't have to wait for the private sector to, recover to the point that that businesses feel that they're strong enough, healthy enough, that, the profits will be there, that they're prepared to go back and hire millions and millions of people. We can't afford to wait for that. And there's too much useful work to be done in the interim. So we can put in place programs that look something like what we did or what they did under the WPA, under the New Deal, the WPA, the CCC, the National Youth. We need youth jobs. We can't have young people by the millions out there, frustrated, bored, angry, we can't have that. So I think that's one thing. And then, of course, we need to do things with infrastructure and housing. We have a housing crisis. I mean, it takes me back to the Deficits That Matter chapter. We have so many deficiencies in our economy, healthcare. I mean, I can sit down and write a budget and we can start addressing a lot of these problems, but climate, has to be at the top of the list. And a lot of things get woven into climate, jobs, poverty, homelessness, we can address a lot of things in addressing climate.
Okay, can we just standardize on some overlaps? So there's the deficit myth. And so this is that the government doesn't have to have a budget that's balanced like your household. That's one of the core concepts, right? And the government can do that because it has its own sovereign currency. So the US can do this, South African Rand can do this, Japanese yen can do this. So is that a new modern monetary theory? Is that MMT? Or are there overlaps? How much is traditional? How much is modern? And what other things are in the recipe? What other concepts do we need to bring together to do that?
Well, so MMT starts by focusing on countries that have what we would call a high degree or a lot of monetary sovereignty. Now, South Africa is a little tricky because they do borrow in foreign currency. And so that does move them, if you imagine a spectrum, and countries like the US and Japan and the UK having a high degree of monetary sovereignty being at one end of the spectrum, and then countries that, outright use somebody else's currency, Ecuador, Panama, or something, and then currency boards and other fixed exchange rate regimes, countries in the Eurozone that adopted the euro. So you've got a spectrum there. many countries have enough monetary sovereignty to be able to orient their macroeconomic policy, their fiscal and monetary policy, around maintaining a good economy, a healthy economy that operates with full employment, where they don't have to be fearful that bond markets are going to take over and move their interest rate in ways that make it unsustainable to service their debt, that they don't have to worry that exchange rates will fluctuate in ways that is going to leave them unable to buy critical imports, food and medicine, energy, that they would be importing, massive inflation. So MMT is useful, I think, across all the spectrum, because it can help countries with little monetary sovereignty understand why it's important to try to capture more monetary sovereignty. Did I get your core part of your question?
Yeah, are there any other input? So like one of the lessons I remember from econ was GDP is consumers plus business investment plus government plus the net change in exports. And one of the things that I hear as you're talking about this is if consumer spending isn't there and if business investment isn't there, then GDP can be made up by the government. But what's different than consumer balance sheets and business balance sheets is the government, especially with a sovereign currency, has a very flexible balance sheet. And so are there any other concepts to help understand this that we should bring in? And that then sounds like it provides some superpowers. And so those superpowers are maybe to help get the economy through a COVID crisis, through a climate crisis. Can it solve an inequality crisis? It took World War II for FDR for us to break out of the Great Depression. Will it take a war for us to break out of this?
I certainly
just understand how some of those pieces might fit together.
Yeah, I mean, so yes, the basic, hydraulics of the system, the mechanics of GDP are such that, GDP is just the way that we measure total spending on newly produced goods and services in the economy. So you're right, you've got spending that happens because the household sector is making purchases, spending that happens because the business sector is buying, spending that happens because government, state, local, federal is spending, and then the rest of the world, right? And you aggregate that and you come up with this thing called GDP. I don't think that GDP is a goal in and of itself, right, to target. But what you want to recognize is that if you've produced output and the demand for that output isn't there, if there isn't someone who wants to turn around and spend and buy that output, then the producer, the seller of that output, has little incentive to continue to produce at that level. In other words, they'll scale production back, they'll lay off some workers. So then you have a real problem, you have unemployment. And there is where MMT can provide a solution. How do we deal with that today? Well, mostly we say to the central bank, that's your what's the word? What's the term of art? Not a ballywick. I don't know. Jurisdiction. That's your job. What's a term?
Jurisdiction.
Okay, I'll take that. There's one that starts with a B, but I can't think of it. That is your job. That is your jurisdiction. So we wait for the central bank, and what do? They play with the interest rate. So to deal with rising unemployment, central banks reduce the interest rate. Why? Because they want to make it cheaper to borrow. So in other words, monetary policy works when it does by driving people into debt, right? We say to people, you need to borrow some money, take out a loan, put yourself on the hook for future repayments, because that's how we're going to restore jobs and provide growth and so forth. MMT says, well, hang on, okay. There's another policy lever. You don't have to always pull the monetary policy lever. There's a fiscal policy lever. So we can spend money directly hiring people and putting them to work. That's one option. Republicans might say, well, but we could do it through tax cuts. Well, maybe. They like to aim in the wrong direction, I think, most of the time, but it's not impossible to imagine the tax cuts, if they are well targeted. It's like a pay raise, right? Your disposable income goes up. You may spend more because your disposable income goes up. That might help restore some jobs and support the economy. So that's just part of MMT. We kind of accept the monetary fiscal nexus. We have different opinions about which of those two levers is the more reliable. And also because Minsky is important in the framework. We understand.
And who's that? Who's Minsky?
Oh, I'm sorry. Hyman Minsky, one of the, I think, most important economists of the 20th century, famous for a few things. One, probably the most famous, is his work in the financial instability hypothesis. So financial markets, understanding the way that the financial system evolves through time from one that's relatively robust, stable, not subject to crisis. And then over time, the system becomes increasingly fragile. And the reason is that people start taking on more and more debt. And at some point, something happens that makes it difficult for people with debt to service that debt on time. The cash flow isn't there, interest rates rise, something happens. And that's when you start to create fragilities in the system and ultimately a financial crisis. So relying on monetary policy to drive people to borrow and spend into the economy does have consequences, right? In terms of private sector debt and the sustainability of the financial system and the economy through time. So MMT integrates all of that. Now, mainstream may not, right? Different schools of thought may not have much of a place at all, if any, for Minsky. We also pay a lot of attention to the work of another great economist, Wynne Godley, who kind of puts the pieces of the economy together by chopping it into different sectors and then helping to show people how important it is for the government's budget to offset changes in other spending or saving, you could say, desires, right? The rest of the world wants to save more in terms of the US dollar. Well, to satisfy that demand, those dollars have to come from somewhere. If the private sector wants to save more and spend less to satisfy that demand, the dollars have to come from somewhere. And the government's own budget can move into deficit or into bigger deficit to help satisfy the saving desires of other parts of the economy, which helps protect jobs and keep the economy more stable through time.
Great. Fadhel, is there anything you want to contribute on that point?
Yeah, well, thank you again, Stephanie, for joining us today. The way I see it, we have a couple of things on the table here that give us the potential, the opportunity to really move the conversation in the policy space in the right direction, I think. One is what Amir presented today, and really the intuition behind this Green Jobs project that we've started a few months ago, which shows, as Amir demonstrated today, we have green jobs are more resilient during, on the way into the crisis. They recover faster on the way out or even during the crisis. Green jobs pay better. Green jobs tend to be safer even in the high contact industries in the middle of a pandemic. So it's like a color-coded picture in your face. You can't deny it. This is, this research is kind of laying out the metric that says, if you want the greatest impact for your public policy spending, we need to be investing in this direction, more resilient jobs that pay better, that are safer, and so on. So it's kind of the bigger metric. And then the second piece we have on the table is the work you've done in the MMT framework that says the spending capacity at the federal level is much larger than what we usually think. There's plenty of firepower. And we have this metric that says these are the areas where we can transform and build more resilience in the economy. Resilience on the green front, resilience in terms of quality of life, resilience in terms of addressing structural inequalities, and so on. And when you think of the MMT work 20 years ago, 25 years ago versus today, we've gone a long way in terms of getting this into the public domain. In policymaking circles, in the media, with the general public. The remaining question is, what's the missing piece of the puzzle to move us from exposing, the deficiencies, the real deficits that matter, and showing that a better world is within reach. We're not talking pie in the sky. It's not going to bankrupt the country. It's not going to cause hyperinflation. And we have a metric that says these are the investments. These are the areas where you can invest in weatherizing the economy, broadbandification of rural areas, all of these things that we kind of learn from what we've done before in the New Deal of the 1930s and other experiences, and just put people in good paying jobs to build this better economy. What's the missing piece that's stopping us from getting there? in the policy space, because this is about executing, in the right direction.
Is that a question to me?
It's a question to you, Stephanie. Yes.
The votes fund the spending. I think there is some timidity still, even though, members of Congress are spinning out these multi-trillion-dollar bills. If you had asked me last year if the House would pass a $3 trillion spending bill with no offsets, I would have said you are absolutely crazy in a million years. And here we are. So we know we can do it. We know they can do it. The risk here is the same as before. Are they getting cold feet? Will they pivot to austerity? Will they start allowing the increase in the deficit and the increase in the debt to undermine their willingness to think big and ambitious going forward about? And if it does, then what it does is it puts us back in a situation where they have to pick two fights over every spending bill. Anything they want to do must be, adhere to pay-go. So it's got to be paid for. And that means that if you want to do something, you don't just have to convince enough of your colleagues to vote for that spending on that thing you want to accomplish. You also have to go around and collect enough votes to pass the legislation that calls for the tax increase or whatever. And a lot of members won't vote for that because they think that makes them politically vulnerable to raise taxes. Some wouldn't vote for a clean bill because they think it makes them vulnerable if they add to the deficit. Then there's just a question of a difference of philosophies. I don't want this, green and clean. I like dirty and brown. And so we have different philosophical ideas about, what good jobs look like and so forth. So
how about this? There was the Copenhagen consensus that laid out, the estimated trillions of dollars to hit goals in health and wealth and earth and equality and trust. So we actually know what the numbers are, at least on a global basis, and maybe those could be scaled to a national basis. You said the words tax increase, but nobody ever talks about tax investment or benefits of taxes versus, just paying a blank check. My application to the White House Fellowship, I wrote a memo to the president as part of the application on tax cuts for auto manufacturers for increasing MPGs. And so that eventually, ended up happening under Obama Biden. So what else could we do to frame this? One is you're breaking the myth of the deficit, that we have more resilience. And as Fadhel introduced, there's more firepower. There's certainly a lot of firepower in capital markets right now, more than anybody imagined. What else? What other frame shifts do we need to get people to elect representatives who vote for this type of power to generate the benefit we all seek?
Look, we need to start thinking in terms of how to budget our nation's real resources, because that is what matters. We are wealthy beyond words in this country, but not because we have more billionaires per capita than anybody else. No, what makes us a rich, wealthy country? We have enormous natural resources. We have 330 million people, and we have, raw materials, and we have, beautiful land, and we have the real material resources that we need to do incredible things in this country. And so, going forward, one of the things that we really do need is to transform the way that we approach the federal budget, the federal budgeting process. When you write a bill right now and you say, I'm a staffer on the Hill, and my member of Congress has this bill. My job is to go around and try to find support for this bill. So I run around the other offices, I pick up the phone, I call, and I say, my boss has this bill to do XYZ. Will your boss jump on it? And the first question is, what's your pay for? Every single time, the first question is, what's your pay for? And if it's considered toxic, if that member couldn't vote for that, tax increase or whatever, then that's it. The conversation is done. You hang up the phone. Why? Because, well, there are politics involved with the tax increase, obviously, but there is also this little issue of the Congressional Budget Office. And if you're going to do any major spending bill that you propose, is going to get run through CBO. And the Congressional Budget Office is this, they say, nonpartisan, independent scoring body, right? They take a look at the legislation and they give lawmakers feedback. The problem is they give them the least useful feedback you could possibly offer. They tell them whether it adds to the deficit, whether it increases the debt to GDP ratio over a 10-year period. That is not what's important, right? So as long as we're relying on a methodology that evaluates proposed new spending bills on the basis of whether they do or don't add to the deficit, we're in real trouble, because a lot of very good bills die at CBO. They get a bad score and then nobody will touch it. It's toxic. It can't go to the floor. It can't get a vote. So one of the things I think we need, I talk about this in the last chapter of the book, is just we need to transform the process so that we're asking independent third party, if we're going to do it that way. You know, we didn't have a Congressional Budget Office in the 1930s. We didn't have a CBO in the 1960s. We got Social Security, we got Medicare, we got interstate highway, we did a lot of good stuff, right? Now we have this obstacle, and it does end up, standing in the way of a lot of good stuff. Now, they may also stop some bad things from happening, and they do. But the point is that we're going to have a really tough time in the years ahead if we continue to make the deficit and the debt the metrics by which we evaluate and judge the worthwhileness of new spending. We're in real trouble.
This will be a good next topic right here. Just want to pause. We originally thought this might go an hour. Of course, there's a very deep well of insight, wisdom here. So we may go up to 90 minutes. Remember, we're recording this. So if you can't stay, you have another meeting to go to. This is being recorded, be replayed on YouTube almost immediately after we finish, and on ESGX.org by tomorrow. All right, so metrics that matter. Fadhel, you're a big fan of general progress indicator, right? That's different. Is that the same or different than GDP? What's the same? What's different? Should that be what we aspire to?
Yeah, you're referring to GPI, the genuine progress indicator, as a better metric than GDP, because everything we measure in GDP includes things like pollution. Every time we clean up an oil spill, GDP goes up. Every time people go for cancer treatment because they got sick from who knows what, GDP goes up. So, and these things get celebrated on TV as, yay, we have economic growth, right? So that's not the right metric. GPI kind of pulls all of those things out and gives us the more direct quality of life indicator. And in the case of the US, when you look at GPI for the last 4 decades, it's been a flat line. And when you break it down by income level, GPI has been declining for lower income people in the United States. So the metric of GDP, of economic growth at any cost, is driving us in the wrong direction. That's one important thing about and we can have a CBO that does an alternative metric that provides a useful service to Congress that says these are the things that matter. And I see a couple of questions in the chat box that are relevant to for example, what a CBO can do that will help us not only recognize the additional spending capacity that we have, but potentially expand the potential spending capacity to achieve more of the public purpose. So to me, that the real risk, as Stephanie said, is running out of productive capacity, hitting into that inflation risk, inflation limit. And to me, the inflation constraint has something to do with running out of productive capacity, skilled people, machinery, technology. The good news about those things, they're producible. So CBO can identify areas of the economy where we would hit a shortage of skills, a shortage of technology, a shortage of resources. Then we can direct resources to producing more of those resources, to producing more technology, training more people in certain areas that we need for the future. Because one thing we know for sure is that the economy constantly moves into higher gear in terms of the necessary skills and techniques required. So if anything, we need education and vocational training more than ever to be ready for the next, gear that the economy is moving into.
Right, so
CBO
Chris,
can do that. The
yeah.
second thing that CBO can do, or the second area where the risk of inflation materializes, is areas of the economy where you have market concentration, market power, what I would call abusive pricing behavior, where key players are able to raise prices because they can, or because we let them, because policymakers or lawmakers, to be more precise, are not doing their job of regulating markets and making sure that markets are more competitive, more democratic. So if CBO is able to identify market concentration, pockets that need to be, democratized via public policy, that will also free up more spending capacity that wouldn't, suck money to the top 1%. So that's a very different CBO exercise than let's obsess over the deficit and debt to GDP ratios. But that requires instructions from policymakers sending a note to CBO and saying, here's what we would like to spend on. These are the national priorities. Give us, where is the inflation constraint? What do we need to do to free up more spending capacity to stop this suffocation that we have over economic activity?
Yeah, and Stephanie, that's very insightful, Fadhel. Thanks for sharing that. And Francisca has asked in the chat, will the US wait for other countries to adopt better indicators like genuine progress indicator? New Zealand and Prime Minister Jacinda down there, she's looking at overall health metrics as well as wealth metrics. The UN has the Human Development Index. That was like the inspiration of why I built HIP Investors. Could we have a Human Development Index that we have for countries? Could we have it for companies and investments? And Archer Christian asks about like a national investment authority to democratize and help ordinary people fight climate change. So what either frameworks or tools, either that we can learn from other countries exist, or that we could blend in the existing political environment, or does it need a complete political revolution to bring some of these in?
I think you raise some useful sort of guides. New Zealand is a good one. I talk in the last chapter of the book about mission-oriented budgeting. Budgets are a statement of values, but they're also a way to express priorities, right? We do have to prioritize, because having a sovereign currency does not mean having infinite ability to spend into the economy without risk, right? Obviously, there are limits. So how do you recognize, and that's what we've been talking about with respect to, how CBO might provide more useful feedback and others about where those limits are. You have to recognize and then respect those limits. And so you do have to prioritize. So, I'm not an expert on what's going on in New Zealand, but as I understand it, they have, or she has, the government has laid out sort of 5 pillars and said, we will communicate. This is transparent with the population. We are going to communicate with you when we put more resources into some area of the budget. We're doing so because it fits into a strategic mission. We are mission oriented. We have these 5 priorities, and any new spending that happens because it moves us closer to delivering on one of these 5 missions. So I think that's a really interesting and maybe useful way to proceed. You mentioned the UN sustainability goals. We have those, but that's what I would do. I would approach the federal budgeting process that way. And I would say, look, we're expanding this program because we see that it works. We believe that it's underfunded, and our experts tell us, and our research suggests to us, that putting X more dollars into this program will help to reduce child poverty rates by Y% over 2 years or 3 years. Then hold yourself accountable. The metrics, the numbers will be there. You figure out what's working, what's not, but you make it clear that decisions are being taken for the purpose of achieving some material change, right? A goal, a mission. So I think, yes, other countries are doing things that we can learn from. I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel. We may have our own versions of some of these things. We might have 7 pillars or 10 pillars. We're a much bigger country, but sure.
All right. Are there other institutions, and Nigel, you may want to come on in a moment to ask your questions too about currencies and states. are there other institutions, for example, we have a ESGX in September on green banks. And so the state of North Dakota has its own bank, which it's had for almost 100 years. California has an infrastructure bank. Are there other types of banks and institutions that we need, or are there other types of programs that we need? What can you share about?
Fadhel might want to say something more on this. When you say that we need, then my answer is no. We have the only bank we need. We have the Fed. And if we could get the legislation, as I said in the kind of opening part of my remarks, once Congress writes the legislation, it's ordering up the funds. That bill is literally a set of instructions to its bank to change the appropriate numbers in the appropriate bank accounts, right? Go make these payments. So really, that's all you need. Now, there may be reasons why states want to do things on their own because they don't think they're going to get the strategic investments that they're after at the state level, because Congress isn't going to take the appropriate steps to pass legislation to accomplish these things. And then sure, finding alternative ways to finance things, because states and local governments, of course, are currency users and they cannot do what the federal government can do. So and the Fed can do more to help state and local governments as well. And some of our MMT colleagues have written a lot about that.
And is there an estimate, like the Fed could do how much? Could it do another 1 trillion, 5 trillion, 10 trillion? There's an estimate that if we paid for all the environmental services we use, that'd be 2 times GDP. So another, 20 trillion. Is there a estimated limit of the Fed capacity?
Well, the Fed's capacity is infinite. I mean, the Fed's capacity now, how much, and the Fed is only going to, well, that's not exactly right, but I'm talking about Congress authorizing spending and the Fed carrying out those payments. So the real question then is, how much can Congress safely authorize? Could the Senate take up the HEROES Act and pass the $3 trillion that the House has already voted on? And would that be a safe amount? I think yes. Okay. Could it be a $4 trillion bill? I think yes. Could it be a $5 trillion bill? Probably yes. Okay, but I would want to model this stuff. I don't want to just kind of go, off the cuff here. But the thing is, do something. I mean, what we're doing now is a lot of harm, because the inaction is going to, lead to further job losses. And then we're trying to climb back up the hill and we're going to slide back, and then we're going to have to climb higher. It's going to take longer. So start doing things. Read the situation, get the feedback. You'll get feedback pretty quickly, but we're going to be in this for the long haul. But again, inflation is the relevant constraint. You run out of unemployed people, well, then you've hit full employment.
Got it. Okay, so full employment is one major goal.
Always, yeah.
And the things that states and municipalities can do can be helpful. The way I see it is when the federal government abdicates its responsibility to fund all the infrastructure and all the things that we've been talking about, there's a role for states and cities to take action and to cobble together some resources, either via a public bank or some state infrastructure bank.
They can also raise taxes.
Raise taxes, yeah. That's their main way of addressing these urgent issues. But at the national level, we did have, during the Great Depression, a Reconstruction Finance Corporation at the federal level that did, fund R&D and infrastructure and all kinds of things, and then was phased away, for a variety of reasons post-war. We can have a green refinance construction corporation that has strategic areas of expertise in green technology and green infrastructure. So think of it as, yes, the funding comes from the federal government, but maybe you need a layer of strategic decision making and expertise that prioritizes which green investments do we really need, where do we place the energy storage units. So that becomes a strategic expertise administration that is funded, has a direct line of credit essentially from the federal government. But to say that we need a green bank in every city to institute a Green New Deal is exaggerated. It can be actually extra cumbersome and a step back in terms of what we can achieve.
Yeah, and I was going to pick up on that because some of what we're talking about has echoes of what came out of the financial crisis and all of the decisions or the push for there to be more infrastructure built. And there are a variety of people that became president or prime minister and said they were going to be the infrastructure president, as Trump did. Tony Abbott in Australia was going to be the infrastructure prime minister there. But most of that is being built at a state level. And then you get into the politics of, if the federal government writes the check for it, someone else somehow gets the credit. How do you break through that? And I guess my question to Stephanie was, if there's a state treasurer listening in, what advice do you give them about practically what they can go and start to do that perhaps isn't dependent on the federal government, remembering that they're also going to get lots of pressure about not running up too much debt so their credit rating doesn't come under pressure? And they don't have the same freedom as the federal government because they don't have fiat currency.
It is tough. Barring sort of extraordinary measures, it is very difficult. What in the world can states do now that you have governors from the West Coast, Newsom, all the way across the East Coast, Cuomo? These are high-profile governors who have been, at it for months on the airways, pleading with Congress, right? There is an urgent need to act. They do not have the resources. So they're not going to step up in a moment like this when their, tax revenues are collapsing around them. They're spending more on public services because the economy is weak, unemployment, social service. They're just trying to hold things together. There's no funding for state and local governments in this moment. So it's a really tough situation.
But one of the things governors and mayors can do is read the deficit myth and empower their constituents so that they speak with a louder voice when they're calling on the federal government to say, it's your responsibility to step up and do this. We have no resources to do it because you tax and spend, you borrow and spend, and during a pandemic, you hit your credit limit, so to speak. So what we need is a greater mobilization of these voices at the state level to essentially call on the federal government to do its job.
Yeah, I mean, even, a lot of people say, well, the Fed should be doing more to lend, to help support state and local governments. The problem is, even with the invitation and the willingness of the Fed to step in and do something like that, you've got governors like Cuomo is a good example. He said, I don't want to borrow. We're already in a hole. The last thing I want to do is take on more debt so that I'm in a more and more, it's like what they need is what Chairman Powell said. We can lend, but we can't spend. They need a one way, right? You own the cash free and clear. They need Congress to act so that there is aid provided and they're not on the hook, because then it will just end up in a situation where they're cutting later. You're plugging the hole, but now they're saddled with all this debt and there will be cuts coming for years down the road. So,
Nigel, do you have another question?
Yeah, the other question I was going to ask was the geopolitical one. We're obviously going through a period now with some enormous shifts in geopolitics, and there's lots of things come with that. I'm really interested in your perspective about what does that mean for, the US and a whole host of other countries that are caught up in that. Does that impact in any way what you're thinking about or what you're saying we should do here? Or can we shut out some of that noise and just focus on a domestic agenda, whichever country we happen to be sitting in?
I mean, that's tough, right? I mean,
we're not going to give you all the easy questions.
Yeah, no, it's not. It's more than just noise, though. You can't shut it out.
Yeah.
You can't. But if we have a president who doesn't want to engage with, foreign partners and wants to withdraw from agreements and turn inward and that sort of thing, you're not going to get the international cooperation that I think probably we all agree is absolutely vital in terms of addressing climate and global recovery. I mean, the whole economy, where you're going to need stronger, richer nations, advanced economies, countries to step up and help, because, there are so many countries that cannot recover on their own. They're saddled with debt. we're going to need, I think, debt restructuring. We're going to need to allow these countries to get out of the debt. We're not going to squeeze them for decades with the IMF and structural reforms and all this kind of stuff. So that's going to require diplomacy and international cooperation. And it would sure be nice to have somebody who was, had a good skill set in those areas. Because no, we can't turn inward. We will be hurt if that is our strategic approach.
But the approach that we've seen in the US in the last 4 years is not unique to the US. There's other places around the world where presidents and prime ministers are following the same strategy. And I think it's a mistake to ignore the fact that this is tapping into real pain globally, not just in the US. Both Trump and Bernie Sanders in 2016, especially in this part of the country and the deindustrialized Midwest, they pinched a nerve when they talked about the deindustrialization, the pain that was ignored by the establishment politics of the right and the left. And this is true in other parts of the world. And that nerve is still raw here in the US and other parts of the world. So if we're talking about, a strategic shift in terms of reaching better outcomes, we can't ignore that real pain. And a lot of it has to do with globalization, international trade, free trade agreements. So the Trump narrative obviously is very different than the Bernie narrative, very different than other people, but it's a powerful narrative that put the blame on immigrants, on China, on Mexico, and that becomes the geopolitics of the world. It's the trade wars. It's blaming, others. And it's unfortunate to see that other world leaders are doing the same. And it works because of that raw pain. And if we don't have a coherent narrative that says, wait a minute, a better world is within reach, and it doesn't involve blaming people or closing borders or doing X, Y, Z, then we have an opportunity to build a different kind of popular movement, politically speaking, to demand that better future that's within reach. And I think the MMT narrative provides the tools to build that coherent narrative that says it's not about the others, it's not about immigrants, it's not about trade, it's about this fictitious constraint that we're putting in ourselves, and then saying we can't spend, we're going to suffer, and it's because of X, Y, Z. So I think the potential for this conversation goes beyond the United States as well.
I couldn't agree more. And you see the exact same tactics being used in politics. And I follow the UK quite closely because I grew up there and I'm very connected to Australia. So I follow that too. And you just see the same thing playing out in each of those countries. And it's horrible to watch, and many people get sucked into it. So having a different and more positive narrative, and you just put it incredibly well. I will go and grab that out of the video afterwards about there being practical things we can do. It doesn't involve pain, it involves opportunity, which will make a real difference to people's lives and can do that quickly, rather than what we've seen, which is, as Stephanie said right up front, absolutely a correct calling out of the pain that many people are facing, but no answer to it, no solution afterwards. It was purely the pain was used to stir people up. So I couldn't agree more, Fadhel.
Great. So as we prepare to wrap up, we've dug in deep. There's a lot more to go. And I just want to call out that some of the examples that we're pointing to, New Zealand, Germany, and others, are led by women leaders, prime ministers, presidents, and they are also tending to have, as Kurt Lieberman of Magni Global pointed out on a previous ESGX, their country ETFs are performing better and their economies are performing better because of this proactive problem solving that isn't stuck in an old model, that's helping pioneer a new model, like Stephanie called out the 5 pillars in New Zealand. All right, so Stephanie, your last chapter of the book is called Building an Economy for the People. We like to end on good news here at ESGX. So what's the vision for the future as you build an economy for the people? And what can we do to help that? You're on mute.
You did. I almost got through a whole webinar without forgetting to unmute. It would be a first. So look, I think, the goal should be to build a good economy. What does a good economy look like? We haven't had one in so long, it's hard to remember. But in a good economy, people can find a job, a good paying job when they want one, a job that has benefits attached to it. In a good economy, people don't struggle to come up with $400 in an unexpected emergency. You don't have 40% of the population unable to meet a financial emergency. In a good economy, you don't have 500,000 people every year being driven into bankruptcy because of medical related expenses. In a good economy, you don't have $1.7 trillion in student loan debt acting like a wet blanket over the economy, holding back 45 million people, who are struggling. In a good economy, you don't have 500,000 people sleeping out rough on the streets at night. In a good economy, you don't have, right? I mean, I can just paint you this picture. So that's what I think, in a good economy, 3 people don't own as much wealth as half the population. I mean, we have to have some rebalancing. It's, using the federal budget to balance our economy instead of always focusing on how can we force the economy to balance the budget? How do we pay for everything? It's just, flipping that perspective and recognizing that we want to use the federal budget. We want to approach the budgeting process, use the budget to achieve a broadly balanced economy, one that provides opportunity for everyone, one that's inclusive, one that's sustainable and resilient and all of these things. And the good news is, the subtitle of the book is Building an Economy for the People. It's not Kelton's world. It's really the people. And that's what's in so many ways frustrating, because there really is broad bipartisan agreement on a number of big policy issues. Independents, Republicans, Democrats, you ask them, do you support? And poll after poll will show overwhelming majorities want the same things. It's only when we get into the sort of brass tacks of attaching the tax increase to pay for it, or we play with the language in other ways that some support can fall off. But broadly speaking, we kind of have an agenda that the nation would support and that the people would want. It's just, how do we get there? How do we get lawmakers to pass bills? How do we move the ball forward on some of these things? So I think people know roughly where they want to go. They don't want to go back to what was normal. That's the thing. I mean, we want life to return to normal. We want to walk around without a mask and feel safe and like we're not going to get, a dangerous virus. But I don't think, in light of the virus and the economic fallout, that we should look at the pieces, the rubble around us, and say, let's pick them up and put everything back the way it was, because that was a good economy. It wasn't. It was not a good economy. And the pandemic revealed in so many ways what was broken and tenuous and fragile about our economy. So let's pick up the pieces and put them back together differently, right? Make it a better, more inclusive, more resilient, more just world. That's what I'm thinking.
That's something we can sign up for. So as Stephen Colbert says, let's move some books. Deficit Myth by Dr. Stephanie Kelton, New York Times bestseller. So please get your copy or get a copy for your friends and colleagues. Fadhel, anything you want to sum up with?
Well, I think what Stephanie's describing here is really about reclaiming democracy and bring the people's economy. Everybody wants, good paying jobs, clean air, clean water, clean environment. Question is, how do you pay for it and all that? And to me, if you look back at the last 100 years in terms of major transformative, socioeconomic improvements, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement, the labor movement, none of this happened via what I would call today, voting once every 4 years or, using the comments section on social media. It works by empowering people, educating, engaging in the democratic process, not just once every 4 years. And that involves organizing and mobilizing and educating your peers and your neighbors to empower people so that they feel and they understand that that better thing is within reach, and it takes their participation and their action to get there. And I think we're at a similar moment, a turning point in US history and world history with this pandemic, that we have, all the trends are moving in the wrong direction and all the resilience problems are not getting addressed. But we know that this is within reach. So, ask yourself, what have I done for democracy lately, other than the comments section and voting once every 4 years? And if you haven't done enough, you should. So this is an open invitation to engage in these conversations beyond our circle of webinars and friends and colleagues, and really reach out into the heart of the democratic process, which is participating with others.
Great. Thanks, Fadhel. Thanks for your deep insights. And I'll just wrap up before turning it over to Nigel and saying thank you, each of you, for joining. A very active chat and question box, very thoughtful questions. Thanks, Dr. Stephanie Kelton, for helping not only imagine the future, but help influence the future through your advising of policymakers and writing and your latest book. Thanks, Fadhel, for Dr. Fadhel Kaboub, for leading the Global Institute of Sustainable Prosperity, based at Denison University in Ohio, in the Midwest. Thanks, Amir Khalegi, for bringing together the Green Jobs Report again under the guidance of Dr. Scott Fullwiler, both of you at University of Missouri, Kansas City. And I'll just put in the health, wealth, earth equality, trust as 5 pillars that we need to address, not only of fixing COVID and our economic situation, but our climate challenges, our injustices on race, gender, and inequality overall, and building a world, building a better world for the people, for us, and it's our money. So Nigel, I'll turn it over to you for good news, next steps, and our next ESGXs. Nigel is on mute. You can see Stephanie's book there.
Oops, I'm sorry. So that is Stephanie's book. I was just saying it's a very good read. One of the things Stephanie said, I think very clearly, jobs are not enough. We've done this before, and we know that the jobs that came back were nothing like as good as the ones that were lost. We have another whole version of this beyond the current recession, driven by the automation of almost everything, which is something we need to be very cautious about looking ahead. So I think this is very timely and important. Just to pick out a few of the other things as we went through that really struck me, the point about we need to think in terms of how we budget for the use of our natural resources. One thing that struck me is that we have focused, the learning from all this is we have focused wrongly on the financial limits on government capacity, and we haven't really thought enough at all about the planetary limits on our economic activity, and all that's completely upside down. And if only we can grasp that, then there's actually huge opportunity in that, and where people think there is pain, there will be the exact opposite. The other thing I was going to draw out really in terms of where we go from this, which is a constant theme through all of this discussion, which is firstly, the need to be open-minded, to accept that there are things that were done in some way in the past, which we don't need to do that anymore, in the same way that we're no longer still putting clothes through a wrangle to mangle to dry them. The world has moved on, and we need to do that with our thinking. Another constant theme here is the importance of thinking beyond the very short term, whether it's in a company in the next annual budget or quarterly results, or it's in a government in the next electoral cycle. I keep having conversations with people that seem to be realizing that if there is a clarity of longer term vision and a longer term story, and Fadhel said exactly a version of this, then that gives something that people can anchor short term action around and hopefully drive in a positive direction. And then the last part of this is, we are dealing with complicated problems. There is not going to be a kind of simple one size fits all, just push this button, fix the problem solution. So it is absolutely the world for systems thinking people and systems thinking solutions. I think we'll see much more of that in the time ahead. So finally, just to wrap up from me, this is also all about people. And I think it's incredibly important that we share these messages, so please do share them with your friends. Post, as Paul said, this will be available on YouTube as a recording a little bit later on this evening, and on the website cut up into segments so you can get to bits that you may be particularly interested in tomorrow. Please subscribe on YouTube. And also just looking ahead in terms of future episodes, if you visit esgx.org, we have details of those. In a fortnight's time, the one which is coming up is all about the role of green banks and what they can do to help drive some of these very important changes. we'll be mailing everybody with details of that over the coming days. So from me, thank you very much. I don't, Paul, if you want to add anything else, but I've really enjoyed the discussion. I think it's been incredibly helpful. So thank you all very much for being here.
Great. Thanks, Nick Gower, our producer, for bringing us all together. And again, Dr. Stephanie Kelton, Dr. Fadhel Kaboub, Dr. Scott Fullwiler, and Amir Kalegi. On behalf of Nigel Lake of ESGX and myself, Paul Herman, we wish you a healthy and safe week. We'll see you next time on ESGX.